My name is Kyla Bennet, and I am the Science Policy Advisor for the nonprofit Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER. PEER is a national nonprofit. We basically are a whistleblower organization, and we support and defend local, state, and federal employees who work in the environmental arena. I have a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology and a law degree, and I became involved in PFAS in around 2018 through a client from EPA who brought me a case on PFAS. So I live in Easton, Massachusetts, which is about 25 miles south of Boston. In 2019, I tested Easton's municipal water and found that it was contaminated pretty badly with PFAS, and brought that information to town officials who did take it seriously. But what happened is we had to go to town meeting, vote on whether we could afford to build a filtration plant. We did, cost us over $9 million, but the plant is not online yet. So I have been subjected to contaminated water since before 2019. We don't know how long our water has been contaminated. We just learned about it in 2019. And it's very, very difficult to say that chemical A causes disease B, to prove that causation. It's easy to make a correlation, but it's difficult to prove that causation. I have been adversely impacted by the PFAS in my water. I can't bathe in it. We have a filter on our kitchen sink, so we use that water. It's scary. We can't take long showers. We have to use special water to brush our teeth. And in May of 2020, I was diagnosed with a brain tumor, had 2 brain surgeries. I almost died. And we're now finding out that PFAS does cause or is correlated with brain tumors. So can I prove that my brain tumor was from drinking my contaminated water? No. Do I feel in my heart that it was? Absolutely. Because our water is so contaminated, we have been advised not to drink it or take baths in it. And so there is a water collection system in the center of town where we can go get PFAS-free water. My husband and I did install a filter in our kitchen sink so that we can drink it and make coffee with it and give our dogs PFAS-free water. But I have been unable to take a bath. You can't really filter your bath water. I do take quick showers. We have to use PFAS-free water to brush our teeth, to make coffee, tea, pasta, for everything. So it's definitely adversely impacted our lives, and we are eagerly awaiting the filtration system that's going to be built town-wide to come online. So PFAS is actually an acronym for per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's a huge class of chemicals. EPA says there are about 14,000 of them. And PFOA and PFOS, or PFOA and PFOS, as some people call them, are just 2 of the 14,000 chemicals that are out there. They are the most famous. They've been around the longest, and they have been the most studied as well. And they're extremely dangerous. In fact, just a few weeks ago, EPA said that there's virtually no safe level of PFOA and PFOS in drinking water. No safe level, similar to lead. So we shouldn't be drinking it at all. And yet, most water systems in the United States of America and around the world are contaminated with higher levels than 0. So PFAS were created actually accidentally in 1938 by DuPont chemists. And they were working in the lab one day, and one of the chemists spilled a substance that they had created on his shoe and then spilled water on it. And he saw that the water beat it up and did not soak through his sneaker. And they realized that they had a chemical that might be pretty handy. And so in the 1940s, they started using this chemical in nonstick cookware, so frying pans, and it was Teflon. They started using this all over and started putting it in a variety of products. So since 1940s, it's now in 2020s, it's in everything. It's in makeup, it's in shampoo and conditioner and fabric softener. It's in tents and backpacks and ski wax and rain waterproof clothing, upholstery, carpeting. It's in food packaging like microwave popcorn bags and bakery boxes. So it's virtually everywhere. It's absolutely ubiquitous. And the problem with PFAS is that every single PFAS, the one thing that every one of these chemicals has in common is a carbon-fluorine bond. And this chemical bond is one of the strongest bonds known to humans. It's almost impossible to break, which is why PFAS have this nickname of forever chemicals, because you simply cannot break them down. So scientists have now studied the human toxicity effects of PFAS, only about 25 of them. And remember, there's over 10,000. There's about 14,000 of them. So we know about 25 of them cause adverse health impacts on humans and other animals as well. They cause thyroid problems. They cause developmental problems. They're particularly bad for pregnant people. They can cause preeclampsia, can cause kidney and testicular cancer, liver problems, and now they're finding a correlation with glioblastoma, a brain tumor, and PFAS as well. So they affect virtually every organ in your body, and they're very, very dangerous given that some of them do actually cause cancer. For example, firefighters. Firefighters have PFAS in their turnout gear, the gear that they use when they're running into burning buildings. And that PFAS is dermally absorbed into their skin. And actually, most on-duty firefighters die of cancer, not from, burning buildings or buildings collapsing on them, but from cancer due to that PFAS in their turnout gear. So because PFAS can cause adverse health impacts, particularly to the thyroid system in humans, it is absolutely true that it can also cause those same problems in other mammals, cats, dogs, even we're finding them in whales, and all sorts of deer, fish. In alligators in South Carolina, a lot of them have tumors. And these alligators are the ones that are hanging out on golf courses, which are sprayed heavily with pesticides, and a lot of pesticides have PFAS in them. So the alligators that have higher levels of PFAS in their blood tend to have these tumors. So we're seeing these health impacts not just in humans, but also in a variety of other animal species, particularly mammals. And with cats and dogs, we have found that some of the flea and tick products that you use to prevent your dogs from getting bitten by ticks or from having flea infestations actually contain very high levels of PFAS. So it's very, very dangerous. And if you think about the cancer rate in domestic pets, this is probably one of the reasons why there's so much cancer in our domesticated animals. So biosolids are basically what is left over after wastewater treatment plants extract the liquid and clean it, and then there's a sludge left over. So if you think about it, a wastewater treatment plant contains both municipal and sometimes industrial discharges, and it contains a lot of human excretions, defecation, urine, things like that. And because we have so much PFAS in our bodies from consumer products and from the water and the food that we're eating and drinking, it's also in things that we excrete. And when this is concentrated down in these wastewater treatment plants, this sludge is turned into biosolids, which are used as fertilizers. So Bloom fertilizer, a lot of fertilizers around the country contain biosolids, which is basically just human waste that's dried up. And they have very, very high levels of PFAS in them. So if you take this material and use it as a fertilizer on your garden or in a farm field or wherever, it will get into the soil and it can get taken up by the plants and actually in the leaves or the fruits or vegetables that you're eating. And there's a scientist in Minnesota who actually did a study. He developed a formula where he can tell pretty precisely how much PFAS will be in a vegetable, depending on whether it's a root vegetable or a leafy vegetable. If you know how much PFAS is in your soil and the percent of carbon in the soil, he can tell you how much is going to end up in your plants. So that's scary because it means that our whole food system is contaminated with PFAS. Now, the good news is that organic farms are not allowed to use biosolids as fertilizer. So chances are organic fruits and vegetables have far less PFAS in them than conventionally grown fruits and vegetables. Very possible, yes. But again, it would have less because they're not using the fertilizer that has PFAS in it. So any farm that uses water contaminated with PFAS is probably going to have fruits and vegetables that have PFAS in them. Moreover, if you think about chickens or cattle or pigs, if they are drinking water that's contaminated with PFAS or eating grass or grain that has PFAS in it, they too will be contaminated. And indeed, in several states, cows have had to be euthanized and milk has had to be thrown out because it's so full of PFAS that it's not safe for human consumption. Yeah, there are basically two different ways that we test water for PFAS. And unfortunately, we can only do a targeted analysis for about 70 PFAS out of the 14,000. And what I mean by targeted analysis is this. We can tell exactly which chemical it is. So is it PFOA? Is it PFOS? Is it PFBS? Is it Gen X? They all have different formulas, different names. If you do a targeted analysis, you can actually figure out which PFAS chemical is in there and how much of it. And we usually do that through a test it's a liquid chromatography mass spectrometry test. But because we don't know how to test for the vast majority of PFAS, what we often do is something called a total organic fluorine test. And that won't tell you which specific PFAS are in there, but it will tell you how much PFAS are probably in there. So it's using organic fluorine as a proxy to figure out how much PFAS you have in a sample. And the nice thing about the total organic fluorine tests is that it can capture all 14,000, even PFAS that have not yet been named. So we can get the universe of PFAS that's in our water, as opposed to just the 70 that we can test for. No, we call them either the total organic fluorine test or a targeted analysis. Those are the names that we use for those two different types of tests. But again, the targeted analysis can only test for a maximum of about 70 PFAS. And the total organic fluorine can capture the universe of the 14,000 or so that are out there. I mean, in order to test for PFAS, if you want to use it for any kind of legal purpose, you have to use an EPA accredited method. So EPA has developed these methods that they say will actually tell you how much PFAS is in a sample, whether it's a water sample or a soil sample or a tissue sample of food, fish or beef or something like that. Mm-hmm. But again, we can only test for 70 targeted ones. So we often use this total organic fluorine, which can test for the whole universe of PFAS that are out there. So EPA has an approved method which measures the amount of targeted PFAS. So you can know exactly which species of PFAS you have in a particular sample. But if we want to look at all of the PFAS that are in your water, we have to do something like a total organic fluorine test. We can remove PFAS from water using granular activated carbon or GAC. There are some other methods like reverse osmosis will also remove PFAS, but it's really difficult because some water treatment methods will actually create more PFAS. So for example, when you're looking at wastewater treatment plants, if you look at the amount of PFAS that's going into that wastewater treatment plant in the influent and the amount of PFAS that's coming out the other end or the effluent, you can actually see more PFAS coming out of the pipe in the effluent than went in. So what's happening there are these PFAS, they're sometimes PFAS precursors, which actually form new PFAS during some kind of treatment. So some treatments actually make things worse. And indeed, there was an article a couple of years ago where scientists tested 8 water filters that were meant to remove PFAS. And they found that 4 of these whole house filters actually created more PFAS than removing them. So we're still trying to figure out how to do it. So we can remove PFAS from drinking water. The problem then becomes, what do you do with those filters, which are now hazardous waste? You can't put them in an incinerator because incineration at regular incineration temperatures does not destroy PFAS. It will just make it airborne. Then it travels up to 150 kilometers and then lands on the ground and poisons someone else. You can't put it in a landfill because then when it rains or snows, the PFAS comes out in the leachate, and then you've got PFAS-laden leachate, which goes to a wastewater treatment plant, which is not taken out by their treatment system and then dumped into a river. So it's this whole cycle. We just cannot destroy it. So we can remove it from drinking water, but it doesn't solve the problem. We cannot remove it from soil or from food. There's just no way to do that yet. And people are working very hard on figuring out new ways to remove PFAS, but it's very slow going. And either the new methods are very expensive, or you can't scale them up to very large sizes. In other words, you can do it, we call it at the bench. So in a lab, on the lab bench, you may be able to remove PFAS out of a test tube. But when you try to make it much bigger and remove it from 100,000 gallons of water, it no longer works. So that's part of our problem, is that we can't destroy it yet. And if we can't destroy it, then why are we still using it? My problem is this: if we can't destroy PFAS, why are we still using it? There's simply no way to destroy it that we know of right now. And so we're dooming ourselves to this cycle of contamination and illness and death. Until and unless we can figure out a way to destroy PFAS, we should stop using it entirely. My local government in Easton, Massachusetts is actually doing a great job. When I went to them and told them that our water was contaminated with PFAS, they took it very seriously, and they went straight to the DEP here in Massachusetts and asked for help, which they got some money to design our filtration plant. The problem is that neither the states or the federal government are doing enough to get a handle on this. And one of the reasons that I say that is because there are so many of these PFAS and they're only regulating them one at a time. Here in my state of Massachusetts, the DEP only regulates 6. That's 6 out of 14,000. EPA just proposed regulating 6 out of 14,000. It's not enough. EPA does not even have a consistent definition of PFAS. Indeed, in different divisions of the agency, they use different definitions. So what they need to do is develop one consistent and comprehensive definition of PFAS. Then they need to regulate them as a class, so all of them. And then they need to ban all non-essential uses. If they continue along this path of regulating PFAS one at a time, it's going to take us literally thousands of years to regulate them all. And by then it will be far too late for not just humans, but for the earth. I think the international community, I think Europe is doing way better than we are. So the EU is already proposing a ban of PFAS in consumer products, which is something that we need to do. But many other countries outside of the EU are not addressing this issue at all. And it's really problematic because we can't, because PFAS are forever chemicals and because they cycle through the environment and because we don't live in a bubble, any country that uses PFAS is going to contaminate the rest of the world. So we really need to all be in lockstep here. And the EU is by far and away the best area of the world as far as addressing PFAS contamination and PFAS use. The US is probably a close second, but after that, there's a lot more to be done. And it's really unfortunate because, like climate change, everything that another country does is going to impact the rest of the world. So we need to get everybody on the same page. I think one of the things that frustrates me the most is people refusing to understand the severity of the problem, including our leaders, our governmental leaders and officials. And part of the problem, I think, is that PFAS is odorless and it's tasteless and it's colorless. So people can drink a glass of water and think that their water tastes fine, and they assume that it's safe. They assume that the government is protecting them. And unfortunately, that's not the case. So EPA and FDA, which are the two federal agencies which really should have a handle on PFAS contamination and use, don't. They're missing in action. EPA is just now starting to regulate a few, but it's too little too late. And people are really complacent about it. And they're also used to the convenience of PFAS. They're used to their nonstick pans and their waterproof raincoats and their waterproof mascara, and they don't want to give it up. And because it takes sometimes years for PFAS contamination to result in adverse health impacts, people don't see the connection. And I think that's part of the problem. And we have to educate people on why the convenience of having waterproof mascara is not worth the threat of cancer or other adverse health impacts. And that's really hard to do. I think scientists are not very good oftentimes at doing PR for themselves and to explaining this to the community and to the general population. And I think we've really failed in the case of PFAS to get people's attention and make them pay attention to how critical this issue is around the world. There are certain portions of the community, like, for example, firefighters, they're now well aware that PFAS in their turnout gear is killing them, and they are trying to do something about it. But your average citizen doesn't understand, because when they turn on the tap, that water looks fine. And if they get sick 10 or 20 years down the line, they're not going to think to themselves, oh, maybe it was the PFAS in my water. They're just not going to even go there. They think that if they can buy a product off the shelves of Target or Walmart or your local grocery store, that it's safe. And that's simply not the case. So we really need to push the federal agencies in charge of protecting us to do a better job here, because otherwise we're going to have a patchwork of regulation in the more environmentally conscious states like the Northeast and California. But then states like Texas and Louisiana and Alabama are not going to have any laws. And it's going to be a very unequal distribution of contamination. And yet contamination doesn't know political boundaries. So if the state of New Hampshire, for example, doesn't do much on PFAS, it's going to come right over the border into Massachusetts. So that's a problem. So we really need these federal agencies to do something, and they're simply not doing enough at a speed that's necessary to protect Americans. Now, again, just like I would like to reiterate that the most important thing to be done here in the United States of America is we need EPA to broadly define PFAS, to regulate them as a class, and to ban all non-essential uses of PFAS. And they need to do it tomorrow. Because right now, what we have, it's like a bathtub that's overflowing, and the taps are on full force, and the water is pouring out, and that's your PFAS. And right now, EPA and the state governments have like a teaspoon, and they're bailing out that bathtub with a teaspoon. And it's not going to do anything because the taps are still on full force. We need to turn off the tap of PFAS in order to get a handle on this contamination. Because even if we stop using PFAS tomorrow, the amount of PFAS in our water, our soil, our food, and our air is going to stay stable for decades, if not generations, before it starts to come down, because they simply don't break down easily. So every day that the federal government delays taking big important steps to stop this contamination dooms another generation of people to adverse health impacts. Well, most of the states are just they were using EPA's lifetime health advisory, which is a ridiculously high number. But there are a lot of states that have much lower: California, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Michigan, Maine, Rhode Island, even Pennsylvania, California. So there's a ton of states that have much lower values. I think right now, Massachusetts has one of the best, but EPA's new proposed limits are going to be even lower than Massachusetts. Yeah, so a woman did a thesis on that recently in 2022, so I think last year, and said it doesn't work. She said that it works only for PFOA and PFOS, not for the other 14,000 out there, and also that there are some problems given that there can be some microbes on the corn that will actually break it down. But again, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we know how to filter PFAS out of water. You can use GAC, granular activated carbon. You don't need to use anything weird, or you can use corn, you can use whatever you want that works. But the problem still remains: what then? What do you do with the PFAS that you've filtered out? We can't destroy it. So it just keeps getting circled throughout the environment. But we know how to filter it out of water. That's not the problem. The problem is that it's in our soil, it's in our air, it's in our food, and it's in our water. And you can't suck out an entire aquifer, for example, or a reservoir and filter it all and put it back in. So you always have that problem. So filtration is not the answer. It's a temporary answer, but it's not a permanent answer. And so I don't care if you use corn husk or whatever you use, as long as it works, but it still doesn't solve the problem. I have not personally investigated Dexorb. I do know that there was a master's thesis written on it in 2022, where they said that it does not do well filtering out mixtures of PFAS. In other words, it appears to work okay with PFOA and PFOS, but you never find water that only has PFOA and PFOS contamination. Typically, you find anywhere from 8 to 30 or 40 different PFAS, sometimes 70 or 80. So if you're only filtering out 2, it's a problem. So the bottom line is we know how to filter PFAS out of water. GAC, granular activated carbon, works great to filter PFAS out of water. Reverse osmosis works to filter PFAS out of the water, but that's not the problem. That's not what we need to be putting all of our energy into, because once you filter it out, what do you do with it? It still doesn't break down. We can't destroy it. You can't put it in a landfill. You can't incinerate it. So you're stuck with this hazardous waste. Moreover, we have to just turn off the tap and stop using PFAS, because even if we filter it out, you cannot filter out an entire reservoir. You can't filter out an aquifer. You can't filter it out of our soil. There's nothing you can do for the PFAS that's already contaminating our soil, our water, and our air. We just have to wait decades, if not generations, to get it out of there, for it to break down on its own, because we haven't figured out how to destroy it yet. So filtration is not the solution to the problem. The only solution to the problem is to stop using this stuff. And unless you use these EPA-approved methods, they won't accept the results. So unfortunately, there are very few labs in the United States or around the world that get good detection limits on testing for PFAS in all of these matrices, in water, in solids. And when I talk about solids, I'm talking about either biosolids or tissue, animal tissue, or foods, or anything that's solid, that's not aqueous. wastewater testing, and then also pesticide testing. So you have to use EPA's methods. There are only a certain number of labs that are certified to use these methods, that know how to do it well, and that have the correct machinery that can actually get you down to a level that's meaningful. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on these labs, and hopefully there will be more labs springing up who can get certified in these EPA methods. Because if you don't use the EPA methods, it's not going to stand up in court, for example. Yeah, it happened to us. So when we were testing Permanone, which is a pesticide in Maryland, it was before EPA had developed their method for testing for PFAS in oily matrices. And we just used whatever EPA test was available, which was the one for water, because there was no other option. And EPA came back to us and said, sorry, you're wrong. We retested with our brand new oily matrix test, and we didn't find PFAS, so we think you were wrong. So it does happen. It will continue to happen. And we have to use EPA's tests if we want to litigate or have any changes in behavior at the municipal or state level. Thank you for sending that, by the way. I don't think so. I mean, again, the problem is we need to turn off the tap, and every day we delay in stopping the use of these PFAS dooms more people to exposure, contamination, illness, and death. And we really can't afford to do this individual by individual regulation. We can't afford to have a patchwork of regulations around the country. We need to regulate these broadly as a class, and it has to be done at the federal level so the entire country is on the same playing field. And if we fail to do that, we are going to doom generations of children to come to this poison, and it's just not right.